Thank you guys for making it to one of the later talks during the conference. I want to start today's talk by telling you guys the story of someone that might be pretty similar to you. I know I feel like she's pretty similar to me. There was once a girl who was very different from all of her peers. Growing up, when she was a small kid and her classmates liked to go out to recess or go play games, she preferred to be with books. When she was a teenager, she wasn't focused on getting into university or exams. She was volunteering at a religious institution in her community. At the age of 19, she founded a consultancy that today has become a global success. She's written 4 best-selling books that have been translated into many languages, distributed across 40 countries. She's been named one of the most influential people in the world. I'm talking of Marie Kondo. Yeah, right? If you are not familiar with Marie Kondo, which a lot of the people I give this talk to aren't, she is absolutely incredible. She's famous for her book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And what her method really comes down to is the fact that cleaning up your home has effects on other parts of your life. So a quick overview of the method, which is simple but effective. You take one category in your home, imagine your clothes, and you find every piece of clothing that you own, and you put it all in one room so that you're kind of overwhelmed by there's way more than you expected. And then you go through the painstaking process. I've done this. It takes a long time. Picking up each item and asking, does this item spark joy? When I see this, do I feel happy or anything? It's surprising how much of your stuff, if really there's no feeling at all. You collect how many conference t-shirts? Yeah. But what Marie Kondo says is if you find these items aren't sparking joy, they don't have a place in your life. And so you thank them for their service, and you discard them, donate them somewhere else. And so just applying this method to everything you own has transformational impact on your whole life. Marie Kondo's clients have a very high success rate. She's never had anyone return. She's also found that her clients tend to have success in other parts of their life that have nothing to do with tidying. They have improved confidence in their ability to make decisions because they've made thousands of decisions over and over. All of their life goals that always just felt a little out of reach, like writing the book or running a marathon, are all of a sudden more tangible. And what we can learn from Marie Kondo is the idea that the environment around you has a tremendous impact on what you actually do. Now, don't worry, I know what you're thinking. Oh gosh, this woman is about to talk to me about why I need to clean my desk. And no. The types of mess that we deal with in the development world are far more sneaky time sucks. I'm talking about the desktop that's cluttered with files, about the calendar that's booked completely solid so that you don't have time for lunch, let alone a snack break. And as developers, the worst mess we run into a lot is really bad code. All of these things do not spark joy, I can say pretty confidently. And that means they are actively taking away from not just your life, but the lives of all of your team. So we're going to talk about some ways that you can actionably fix these problems. And as I go through this, I hope you're going to pick up a handful of things at least that you can do today with your teams. But more than that, I want you to start thinking about all of the ways your processes are impacting what's actually happening. You can be the best developer in the world, but if you're constantly encumbered by really, really complicated processes that spark no joy and don't really serve a purpose as far as you're concerned, you're not going to be nearly as successful as you could be. So, the first place we're going to start is something that no matter how junior or senior you are in this room, we all share in common. And that's the fact that we all only get 24 hours every day. Imagine if me or someone else went through your calendar of how you've spent your last month or your last week. And we counted up how much time you spent on different activities. Would the tally reflect what's actually important to you? Would it be high in your family, low in your work? Often not. And it's not that we don't intend to spend our time with the things that matter. It's that a lot of these sneaky things will come in and start by taking just 15 minutes. And then that 15 minutes becomes an hour. And that stacks. And eventually you've lost days, weeks, months of your life to things that did not help you at all. In the workplace, we often find this in the form of meetings, which I know every dev loves so much. I am the dev that loves meetings, and that puts me in the minority. But they are really great. Meetings are one of the only places we can share ideas, debate, form a decision. They're incredibly important for creating cohesion amongst a lot of different people. So the question is, if meetings are so great, where does it all go wrong? I tried to find statistics on how much time are we wasting in meetings. And it's really challenging. There's not a lot of unbiased surveys about how much time any person spends in a meeting. But I did find one link. Lucid Meetings, the founder of that company, named Elise Keith, did an extensive amount of research about how much time was being wasted in meetings in the US. I didn't feel like that was as applicable here, so I went and redid her calculations using some EU numbers I was able to find from about the same time. Based on these calculations, and assuming we're all about equally as effective as we were 4 years ago, there are about 86 million meetings every day. That's not shared experiences, that's me and the three gentlemen in the front all having one meeting. Top names 86 million each day. And so of these meetings, they generally run on average an hour and 15 minutes. Now this varies, of course, and you have to account for the fact that the earlier in your career, you probably don't have as many of these meetings, whereas executives, management has basically all meetings, so it is not equally distributed. But across the board, when you ask people, was that meeting effective? Did you get anything get out of it? We tend to find 29% of the time we did not. And that number is way lower than I expected, by the way. But when you combine that with how many meetings are taking place, we're looking at 31 million hours wasted daily in meetings that aren't a good use of our time. Or if they are, we don't understand why, and that doesn't really make it any better. This can definitely be solved, and it starts with the first piece of what I'm going to call a tithing principle, which is making sure everything you do, this applies for all of your processes, I'm going to introduce these as we go, but everything you do should only have one single purpose. Have you ever tried to be two places at once? It has probably not been successful. If you have been, please come find me after this because I want to know how. But otherwise, trying to do two things at once generally leads to you doing neither thing at all. So your meetings, as well as all your processes, should really only have one purpose. And even better, this purpose should be stated in the meeting so that everyone attending knows what it is. How many of you have attended a meeting where you didn't know why it was happening, even after you left? Yeah, that's the worst. So where I work, not only do we have this single purpose, but we also list an agenda, which is kind of the game plan for how we're going to accomplish that purpose. And if I get meeting invites without these things, I often just reject the meeting because this person is not adequately prepared for how we're going to spend our time. The next problem we kind of run into is, for whatever reason, I tend to find meetings by default have to be in 30-minute increments for some reason, which isn't really the way that all work needs to be segmented. And the problem is, we try to give ourselves extra time, even though we know we don't need that much. An example is I might be meeting one of my coworkers to talk about a new deployment process we have. And we want to involve someone else, but that third guy, he's running late. And since we're waiting on him, we're going to chat about whatever's going on in the office because we don't want to repeat ourselves. That would be silly. By the time he gets there, it's 10 minutes late and we're way off track. So we have to spend more time going back to what the subject was that we were trying to talk about. Now we're in our meeting and we start talking about it, but oh my gosh, we all just remembered this crazy production bug that happened last week, and we should talk about that because it's funny and interesting. And we only needed 20 minutes for this hour meeting, right? Before you know it, it's the end of the meeting. We're trying our best to cram in last thoughts to make sure we actually did the thing we were there for. And somebody's trying to kick us out of the room because we've quickly elapsed how much time we were supposed to have. This happens constantly, and it drives me crazy. It probably drives you crazy too. So to combat it, I would argue that you should trim your meeting time. Parkinson's law tells us that your meetings will take absolutely as much time as you give them. And so when you find that your meetings are always running over, you actually might save time if you cut them shorter rather than try to give them more time. I did this recently with a project manager, and the results were incredible. I love not having 3-hour meetings as opposed to one 30-minute meeting on my calendar. The other thing, and I think we're all familiar with this, is that we get distracted in meetings a lot. Now, hopefully you guys aren't attending meetings with like 20 plus people in them. That's really a meeting that could be done over an email. About 6 to 8 people is optimal meeting size. But if you have somebody that really can't get off their phone to pay attention, there's a good chance they aren't needed at all. And if they are needed, maybe it's only for 5 minutes and then they can leave. Because even though it's a problem, you're not getting this important person's attention in your meeting, it's actually a problem for everyone else as well. People, when they see other people do things, kind of get a signal that this is what's okay. And if they see the most important person in the room on their phone or on their laptop during your meeting, that indicates to them it's probably not that important. I try to ban devices at all of my meetings, particularly ones where I want people engaged in working with me, because that's the meetings I find are the best use of my team's time. It's pretty easy, too, to just state this rule up front before anyone's offended, and then you aren't singling anyone out. Now, that's all on meetings, because we're going to move on to another topic that developers really, really love: documentation. Yeah, second only to meetings, right? No, none of us got into this work because we really loved writing everything we did. We got in the work to solve problems, but we all understand documentation is a necessary evil. If you don't document, you'll fall into the tribal knowledge problem, which describes when somebody on your team knows so much information that's not put anywhere, and if they leave for whatever reason, that knowledge is lost. A quick quiz to see if maybe tribal knowledge is an issue where you are. Think of either yourself or someone you consider very critical to the team and see if these statements would apply. I have people who can't work unless I come and unblock them with things I know. If somebody asked me to write down everything you need to do my job, it would take forever and I would never get work done. I can truly never be replaced. Now, all of these things sound kind of good. It's like that comfy veil of job security, but it's kind of a problem. Because if you're stuck solving the same problems over and over, you're not getting to work on that cool thing you've always dreamed of. You're doing the same thing over and over, and ultimately that's going to be far more replaceable than somebody that shares and trains other people. So, while you might have gotten into this mess on your own, you're going to get out of it by working with others. Let me see in the room, who practices paired programming or has in the past? Awesome, I love seeing that. If you haven't, really, really great link here that provides resources on not just why you should pair programming or do pair programming, provides guides for how you should get started and the research that backs why it's effective. I encourage pairing for my teams for everything we do because I find it's the most effective way to kind of cross-train knowledge sets. Juniors are incredibly helpful for this piece as well because they don't know anything. So their questions are everything that you need to capture. I'll try pairing a junior with my most senior resource, and we'll have them write down all of the natural questions that come up as they work. This gives you the list of things to document. Then people can take turns documenting which thing is important, as well as how to solve it. The junior gets to be able to give value that they've never been able to give before, and the senior gets to help teach somebody something new. Another great way to attack the tribal knowledge problem is to share work. If you're the person that always handles the security tickets in your queue, give them to the person that knows the least about security. That's the surefire way to make sure they learn a lot very quickly. And the other thing you got to make sure you do is that you measure that this documentation you've written is actually effective. I can imagine few things worse than writing out a document and then never using it again. That's truly a waste of time. You can measure effectiveness by pulling a third person in and asking them to solve a problem using the documentation you've written. You can measure it in other ways too. It doesn't have to just be testing what you wrote. A coworker of mine at my company, VMLY&R, does this with vacation. Imagine, this is my dream vacation, by the way, on the beach with a nice beer, whatever vacation you're planning right now or would like to. Imagine you finally get there and it's finally quiet. You're away from everything. And then your phone starts ringing. Oh God, production's down. You're the only one that can save it. That's not how you plan to spend your restful time. And it sucks. My colleague at VMLY&R, it runs our ops team. And so operations is hands down one of the people that gets contacted when things go wrong. And what he does is measures every single vacation day someone on his team has, and if they get contacted to solve an issue or point somebody in the right direction on their day off. He's got a 90% success rate, but he's shooting for 100. This is also a great way to make sure people are actually taking vacation. But while tribal knowledge is a known issue, it's not the only problem when we're talking about documentation. I call it the opposite of tribal knowledge, drowning in information. This is, in my opinion, way worse than a lot of tribal knowledge, because when you're drowning in information, people have definitely wasted their time. An example of this was 5 years back, I worked in a data integration team. Data integration is a pretty central point. We do a lot of on-call because we're kind of the first place that things fail often. That 24/7 on-call was a great experience for me. And in doing that, our team had about 40 people. And in our eagerness to make sure we were sharing as much information as possible across 40 people, we had 3 different places that you went to document your work and what it did and why it was important. And because, as you would predict, nobody really enjoys filling out the same information in 3 different places, they were inconsistently used. And even worse, if something changed, they wouldn't match. They'd have conflicting information. So I'd get called out at 2 o'clock in the morning, can barely think, let alone process and debug properly. And I've got conflicting information across multiple sources. It would have been better if I had no information and started where I had to go anyways, which is the code with the core of the problem. This is the kind of thing that you run into if your documentation is not navigable and does not have a clearly identified purpose. At nearly every organization I've joined, I've found some version of this problem. We kind of shove documentation towards the end of our processes. I don't know, Alexandra White gave a great talk on documentation you guys should check out when you see the videos for this talk. But she kind of acknowledged we don't treat it like the first-class citizen that it should be. You should be held responsible for the documentation that goes along with your code. And that means you should also organize it in a way that people can find it. You wouldn't have files for different React components all over your code base with no structure. So your documentation should also have a structure to it. When I join a new group, one of the first things I do is I get all of that mess and I start categorizing it, similar to the KonMari method. I put debugging guides in one section, onboarding information, domain knowledge specific to this business in another. And then once I've got things in a natural grouping, it's a lot easier to understand why I might come here. I make a lot of table of contents guides, and that's truly what seals the deal, because now when somebody starts in their first day, we can give them this starting point, and they've got a way to find all of the things they need, even if they're very different, or they don't know exactly what these words mean yet. They bookmark that, and then they have a still up-to-date guide of where all of these things could go. The other documentation we do that I see developers mess up a lot is our source control logs. Does this look familiar? Have we all offended at one point or another? Because I have. We find maybe that we start with the best intentions, and then we slowly degrade as we go. A coworker of mine likes to say, you should write your code like the guy that's going to inherit it is an axe murderer that knows where you live, which is a little violent, but it's a good idea to think about the person that's inheriting your work. Now, we think about that a lot with our code and making sure our code looks clean, but imagine if we wrote code that looked like these commit messages. It's really rough. I've got get requirements here, get requirements actually, okay, really this one works, which sounds ridiculous as a method name, yet we kind of do this all the time when it comes to our version control commit messages. Think about all of the ways that you could be helping that person on a 2 a.m. call in the future that very well might be yourself, because we all know we kind of forget what we wrote within 2 weeks later. And make sure you're writing commit messages that help. That brings me to the third principle of dev team tidying, which is that you need to communicate concisely with your future audience in mind. I don't want 3 pages. I want a concise thought that's easy to consume. Ideally, if you have a single purpose that you know works, this shouldn't be challenging. We're going to walk through the ways that I push my team to make sure we're doing this throughout all of our source control. And it starts at the very beginning with the code you're working on in a focused commit, meaning get add dot is not your friend. When you've done get add dot, you don't actually know what you've committed. It could be the authentication service you were trying to change. It could also be a scratch file that you made to map something out. It could also be a couple of spare characters that you accidentally typed in the wrong window when you meant to do it in the terminal. Instead, I propose using wildcards, and I do this a lot. One of the benefits that come with using an approach like this is not only are you more confident that your commit is small and focused, but your thinking around the code you're writing is better too. I use get add dot when I'm not even totally sure why it works. I use get add wildcard, the name of my file, because I know what change I've made. When my team started doing this, they were a little hesitant. They didn't like it because this is easy. But they found that when they started doing this, the quality of the code they were writing went up as well. This is only as effective, though, as having that commit message that's also focused and helpful. I have some examples in here, and I feel like I should throw a disclaimer that these are all made up, inspired by real events, but the names are not the real offenders here. So I don't know if you've seen this. This is updates is a commit message I've seen a few times, and it does not help me understand what happened. You might as well have put code in terms of what you changed. Consider this, which is pretty clear exactly what's going to happen. If you work in a team that has a ticketing system, I would highly recommend you get used to it, putting the ticket number you're working in your every commit message as well as your branch. It makes a tremendous difference down the road. Jira links them really well together. The other half of this is to make sure your commit message isn't longer than a tweet. If it takes you more than a tweet to describe what you didn't have a simple focused commit in the step before. You should probably go back and change what pieces you're committing. When you pair these things together, it becomes really powerful. Think of it like a method that just does one thing very well, very simply. It's much easier to think about small, focused things. Now, these things add up. And I kind of compare this to physical branches. I couldn't find really good GitHub examples. Imagine this branch here is what I call a branch with and alsos. So you fix the authentication service in your TypeScript file. And also, you went and updated some random documentation that had typos. And also, you fixed the style bug that's been bothering you. And in theory, you made the code better. You fixed problems, so it's improved, right? Versus, all I did was fix the authentication service that the branch name suggested I would fix. Now, at the onset, this isn't a huge problem. But it's when down the road your branches are stacked up and you have a great deal of changes. And at this point, it becomes very cluttered and hard to see why a change was made. It definitely doesn't relate to the ticket name because I've never seen a ticket that says fix a typo and a style fix and an authentication service. Versus if you have 3 different branches that each do one thing simply, this is so much easier. Oh my gosh. Versus trying to find something in this mess is challenging. And these really come to life when you see the pull request. So pull request system is pretty much mandatory at my shop. And when I look at pull requests, the smaller ones are always the ones I'm excited to read. Because when I see this, 40 changed files with 700 additions, like, oh God, that's going to take hours. I kind of try to hide that and pretend I didn't see it because I know that's going to take a lot of work. This change probably wasn't thought through as well. It probably needs a lot more tender love and care and research to make sure that it's actually doing things and not introducing bugs. Versus, consider one change file with 1 addition and 1 deletion. I see this, I'm going to go approve this immediately, probably, because it's so easy. And yes, this is a little exaggerated. I've seen more than 40 change files in a single pull request. Usually you're going to have more than 1. But if you focus on trending closer to a smaller pull request versus a giant one, you'll find your work actually moves faster. This was another point that my team fought me on initially. They're like, gosh, if we do like 5 small pull requests when I could have just done 1 big one, I'm going to have stacked dependencies. It's going to take forever. And that actually wasn't the case at all. These giant PRs were the ones that would sit for days, versus these could be done in minutes. You could even just tap someone on the shoulder and they could quickly know exactly what you changed, that it was effective, that you weren't adding bugs or tech debt. It also allowed us to have much better conversations about what was wrong. If you've had the PR with like 50 comments, it's really, really difficult to context switch constantly about the different problem you're trying to solve. If you have it all in one single pull request, it's so much easier. And then you proved out a concept once before you have to go make the same change 20 other places. These are only as helpful, though, as the context you give them. So step 5 is making sure you have context with your pull request. Bad button I fix is very unhelpful, particularly if I change many files. Who knows, like how many buttons does your site have? Probably more than 1. We really like to use screenshots. And when you see this, hopefully you know exactly where that is because it's awful looking. And we're all a little embarrassed it made it into the code in the first place. And it gives you much better context so that your approvers don't have to think as much when they're looking at your code. If you put up your code because you're hoping to be able to move quickly, things like this take you very little compared to the amount of time it takes your coworkers to think about the problem you're trying to solve. We also found a lot of really great help with pull request templates. So this served a couple of purposes for my team. One, pull request templates meant that all of our information was in a repeatable, consistent fashion. So everybody had their ticket in the same place. Everyone had their description in the same place. It also meant that we were able to do checks on everything that we had. We would have kind of a checklist that went hand in hand with this and would help describe things like, did you test it in Internet Explorer? Because Mac users really do not enjoy that. Did you make sure it follows accessibility requirements? Did you unit test it? In doing this, it held our developers accountable for the best practices and standards that we said we followed, but you might sometimes let slide. And it made sure that everybody was on the same page about what was going to be changed in this branch. Now, I think all of this is really, really important because the worst mess that we find is one we're never going to get rid of, and that's really messy code. Messy code, or really how I think of it, technical debt, is absolutely inevitable. I'm not going to go into all of the different types because that really merits its own talk, and a lot of really smart people have already talked about it. But I do want to just address the fact that it is 100% going to happen. And the first piece of that is because requirements changed. Unless someone in this room has figured out how to predict the future, which I'm guessing not, there is 100% chance that the solution you decide today will change in the future in ways that it would have been silly to design for in the beginning. The other thing is that technology changes. Frankly, a JavaScript framework may have been invented over the course of this talk. It's also not crazy that your stack is going to be outdated after even only a year at the pace our industry moves. Most importantly, however, is that hopefully you're changing as well. You're coming to events like this and talking about ideas with your colleagues, and you're really working through new and better ways to do things. My sincere hope is that a year from now, you're writing code in a different and better way than you are today. With all of that in mind, when you look back at something you've written before, there is going to be some reasons that you'll have to change it. And it kind of sucks. Tech debt is a huge cost. Now there's the opportunity cost, right? That if I spend time working on something old, it's time I couldn't spend on working something new. But the human cost is what's really concerning. No developer really, really loves working with messy, difficult to read and think about code. A lot of us prefer the new shiny thing. When I work with my client companies, I have developers who are so embarrassed, and it's really sad. They're like, oh gosh, please don't look at that old, just don't even look at the old stuff because I don't want you to think this is how we work. And that wears on people. Eventually, in an industry that is as fast-paced as ours, you'll lose your best talent because they can go work on something really cool and really new somewhere else. So hopefully the answer to this problem is easy, is that we have to fix our technical debt, and we have to review the way we wrote things before to make sure they still work now. And this is where I tie it to our last principle of dev team tidying, which seems obvious in the case of tech debt, but for some reason seems to get lost when we're talking about other processes. You should always be reviewing the things that you have to make sure they're still serving that purpose that you designed early in the beginning. And I'm not saying you're going to reassess every day if your change request process is effective, because that would be maddening. But the big point here is that we do this because this is the way we've always done it. It should never be an excuse to avoid changing something. When it comes to addressing that in the terms of technical debt, the first step is admitting the problem, which we've addressed should be clear. I've seen everyone from solutions architects to junior developers crippled by the thought that the thing they write is going to add debt. And if you acknowledge it's going to happen, then you have a better chance of making sure it's prudent and not something that you did on accident. The second piece is that as you're going, you know the areas of your code that are most likely to be carrying loads of technical debt. And as you go through a project, you should keep a list of that and document that, because it means you can help hold people accountable to actually doing something about it. How you address debt is obviously going to be working with a team. There's a lot of different strategies that work for different people. I've seen some teams devote an entire sprint just to bringing down their technical debt. I've also seen some teams do a rotation of one developer per sprint addressing just debt. It doesn't really matter necessarily which strategy you choose, as long as everyone on the team knows what it is and it's written out. Because when you have an identified strategy that everybody understands, that means two things. First, that we all have agreed that there is technical debt and that is a priority to fix it. It's not something we're sweeping under the rug. It's not something we're going to fix someday. We have a strategy and this is how it's done. And two, it means people are working in the same direction. You don't want one person trying to fix it one way and one person trying to fix it another way. You want everybody on the same team. This is, again, paired programming, extra plug, where this can be really, really helpful in fixing your technical debt issues. Ultimately, fixing technical debt, as well as all of the processes we've talked to today, comes from building a culture of craftsmanship at your organization. Commit to doing quality work, not just in the code where it feels the most important, but at every stage in the process. When your team commits to having more effective meetings, more meaningful documentation, more meaningful processes around the code, all of these things that take up a lot of time and we don't have joy, they can take more pride in their work. And I struggle to think of a time where a team would be producing better work than when they're taking joy and pride in the things they're creating. These are the dev team principles we've reviewed. When they come together, it helps as a powerful tool to make sure all of your processes, whether it's timesheets, documenting your code, setting up meetings, making sure all of these things are working together to make the lives of your team better. There's one more principle I haven't totally addressed, and there's not really a great word for this. This is something I found when I was researching Marie Kondo. I call it the ugly umbrella principle. A question Marie Kondo gets a lot when she talks about her tithing method is, what if I have something that doesn't spark joy, but is really useful? Consider an umbrella that you think is hideous, but it's the only umbrella you own. Should I throw it away and just be stuck in the rain? Or should I keep it and be miserable? I liken this, by the way, to a timesheet process at work that nobody really particularly enjoys. Marie Kondo suggests a third option, which is to change your relationship with the object and change your attitude. You might not love this umbrella. It might spark disgust rather than joy because you hate it so much, but you probably hate being in the rain more. In the example of timesheets, I really love being paid on time. So when I fill out my timesheet, I think about the paycheck that I'm going to get on the date that I expect to get it. And that makes me have a little bit more gratitude towards the thing I have. Hopefully, you're not all dreading going back to work and dealing with mess, because mess is kind of a good thing for us. It means there's an opportunity to make something better. And that's really what we're all here to do. I'm going to check out questions now, but thank you. All right. I love, let's see, mob programming. Interesting question. I have yet to see it done effectively. My feeling is that paired programming works really well because it's the first step out of programming in a silo. I think there's trade-offs, right? There are certain concepts that your whole team might need to be thinking about and learning about, introducing new patterns. That's where I think mob programming can be really effective. I think for a lot of knowledge transfers and relationship building, though, you're going to find paired programming is better because it's just different working even in a room with 3 people versus working one-on-one with somebody. Next question was tips to start on documentation for an 8-plus-year-old project. Yeah, we had one of those. Piecemeal. It's similar to how you start with unit testing, which is every single time you touch something, you leave it a little better than you found it. If this 8-plus-year-old project also doesn't have unit tests, it's probably really fragile. So in that case, you should try to add just a little bit at a time. If you're adding a little bit, and if it's focused and simple and concise, then you're going to improve it over time. Don't overwhelm yourself with a whole bunch at once. Attack it piece by piece. Those are all the questions I have here. Does anybody have one that's easier to do in person? Great. Well, thank you guys so much for being here.